Hello to all our Floyd County students from Cave Spring and Pepperell and Model and Johnson and Armurchie and Garden Lakes and Alto Park. All of you Floyd County schools kids, and maybe a few of you city school kids will listen in to some of our Young Tales kids at Anna K. Davey or West End or East Central or maybe some of you folks from St. Mary's Catholic School or the Montessori School from Rome who've enjoyed our Young Tales program. Some of you might tune in to our Arrowhead time together here. You know, I retired from teaching after many years in 2013. So I've had 7 years of retirement, but I didn't really retire. At my retirement party, well, one of my former student teachers was there, Miss Vivian Davis, and she's the director at Arrowhead Environmental Education Center. And she said to me, she said, Terrell, you know, we're going to have an opening up here for a part-time job being a naturalist at our center. You love nature and you love storytelling. You could come up here and tell stories to our kids and go out to the schools and take animals and it could be fun. And I thought, wow, I retired at exactly the right time. Here I was all worried about retirement and shoot, here I had the perfect retirement job and I've been out there for 7 years. And this is the time of year. April, for heaven's sakes. That's when we have lots of kids coming out on those pretty spring days to Arrowhead to walk over the fields and along the creeks and the lakes and look at the beaver lodges and the beaver dams. Oh, I love doing that. But along came that old virus, right? Sent us all home. Here I am in my home. It's an old house right here on the levee in Rome, built in 1869. Wow. And I'm here in this wonderful old house. I love my house, but I'd rather be out there at Arrowhead with a bunch of kids walking around showing them some neat things outside. Well, one of the things that I always did with my students in the regular classroom was I always read them one of my favorite children's books. It's called The Lion's Paw. Here's how that happened. Way back in 1970, I was dating this pretty blonde-headed girl from down in Florida. She went to my college with me, and I had graduated, but she was still there. And we were dating, and she told me, Terrell, if you're looking for a good book to read to your students, let me tell you about one I read when I was in 6th grade. It's set in Florida, and it's called The Lion's Paw by Rob White. I really liked it. I'll bet your kids would like it too. And she loaned me her copy. Here it is. It's an old Scholastic copy. And back when it was published, you know how much it cost? There's the price right there. I don't know if you can see it. 35 cents. So I took this very book up to Liberty Elementary School in West Virginia. Now, I lived in a little town called Eleanor, and it was right on the Kanawha River, named after Eleanor Roosevelt. And in the mornings, I would get in my little 1969 Opel Kadett. I named it Sam. Well, time out. I named it Sam because my girlfriend's name was Sheila Ann Matthews, S-A-M. So I named my little car after her. But at any rate, I'd get in that Opel Kadett and I'd ride up the highway right alongside the Kanawha River till I got to a little tiny village called Red House. And then I'd take a lift and it would wind right up a mountain and across to a tiny little village called Paradise. That sounds nice, doesn't it? And I go right through Paradise on to another little village. There was a school there called Confidence. Isn't that an interesting name for a town? And then a little bit farther to just a little crossroads with a big general store, several houses, and a little schoolhouse. And that was Liberty, West Virginia. That schoolhouse had been just a 2-room schoolhouse the year before. But the year I was there with a group of folks from the teacher corps. I think there were 3 of us. And then the one teacher who had been there the year before. And we had that whole school to ourselves. You know how many kids? 56 children. That's all the kids that were in the whole school. All of them from those farming villages right there. If it rained real hard, most of the kids couldn't come to school because the school bus had to ford some creeks. And if it rained hard, the creeks would be too high for them to ford, and only about half those kids could come to school. So we might only have 25 kids at school that day. But it was a wonderful year. And when my girlfriend, now my wife, told me about this book, and I read it and loved it, I took it up to Liberty and read it to my kids up there. And they really liked it. And you know what I've done? Every year since then, when I've had a homeroom, I haven't always had a homeroom, but every year since then, when I've had a homeroom, I've read this book to them. This very book, the first few years, matter of fact, I read it so much that the front cover came off and the back cover came off, and the pages over the years have turned brown, and somehow or another, the first few pages have been torn so that there are a few places where you can't even read it. So this copy is not very good anymore, but I keep it for old time's sake. That was my first copy of The Lion's Paw. And I continued to read it to my kids. And then in the 1980s, I read somewhere, and I don't know how I found out about it, but I read that Mickler House, a publisher down in Florida, had republished The Lion's Paw. Well, I wanted to get a copy, so I ordered one. And let's put this book back. Oh, where'd the cover go? I must have it on the back. Oh, anyway, I ordered this book. It came all brand new. It doesn't look so brand new anymore, does it? The Lion's Paw. And for many years, this is the copy of the book that I read to my students at Pepperell Elementary School. Well, maybe at McHenry. I know I read the other one at McHenry Elementary School. And in the first few years at Armurchie Elementary School when I was there. Wonderful, wonderful book. And then I left teaching for a little while. And it was mostly during that time that computers really took over. And when I came back to Armurchie Elementary School and read again from that green book for a while, the internet became a big thing. And one night, 12 or 13 years ago, well, 12 years ago, I read online. I found a place online called thebookfinder.com that talks about books that are out of print, that are no longer, you can't get them in print anymore. You can only get used copies of them. And so I looked on that list and found The Lion's Paw, and guess what? The Lion's Paw, for several years there, was the #1 requested out-of-print book in America. How about that? And so I started looking for it. And I'd look on Abe Books online and other online sources for books, or even on what was eBay. I was beginning to look on there for books. And every now and then, The Lion's Paw would come up. If it was one of these little paperback copies, if it was in good shape, it might go for $15 or $20 just for an old paperback copy. And if you could find a school copy of the original book, or maybe the Mickler House book, it might be, $30, $40, $100 or more. And if you could find a good, clean, original copy of it, it might be several $100s, especially if it was signed by Rob White. And so usually when I found them, I couldn't afford them. But one night I was looking online and I found an article from a newspaper down in Florida that was reporting on the fact that Rob White's widow and his stepdaughter, Leslie, had decided to reprint the Lion's Paw. They'd formed their own little company called AW Inc., and they had reprinted the Lion's Paw. Oh, wow, I was excited. I had to have a copy. And so I looked online, and I found the address and phone number for AW Inc. Incorporated. And it was late at night, but their address was out in Utah. Well, shoot, that's a whole nother time zone, isn't it? So I decided to call just in case there was somebody still in. Well, nobody answered, but just a few minutes after I called, my phone rang, and guess who it was? It was Leslie, Rob White's stepdaughter. And she and I had a 30-minute conversation. Oh, we had a good time. Well, I had a good time anyway. I may have done most of the talking because I was so excited. I had to tell her all about how important the Lion's Paw had been to my classes over the year. How when I'd run into a former student, maybe from decades ago, at Kroger or at Walmart, and we'd talk about our classes, they'd always remember just a couple of things that I could count on them always remembering. They almost always could remember me reciting a poem from Lewis Carroll's book, Through the Looking Glass, called Jabberwocky. And I'll probably record that one in a podcast one day too. And the other thing that they almost always could remember was our reading the Lion's Paw together. So they didn't remember the math lessons or the history lessons necessarily, but they remembered the Lion's Paw and Jabberwocky. So I had to tell her all about that. We had a wonderful conversation, and by the time it was over, I had ordered 10 copies of the book, and she shipped them to me, and she inscribed each one. She asked me who I was going to give them to, and so I gave her a whole list of names, and she inscribed them. So I had an inscribed, signed copy by Leslie for our school library at Armurchie Elementary, for my niece, who was teaching 5th grade at the time, for my nephews, Mark and Lewis, who I'd visited, because Lewis had gone with us to some storytelling and all. I knew he would enjoy it, and Mark would too, for that matter. So we gave a copy to them. I gave a copy to each of my student teachers that had worked with me in the last few years and had them inscribed, because I thought they'd like it since they at least knew about it, even if they were not always there for all the reading of it. And of course, I had one for Sheila and for me. And then I had one for each of my daughters, Brandon and Lillian. And they came in and they were wonderfully inscribed. So that's this one right here. Isn't it pretty? The dust cover looks a lot like the original dust cover. The book's a different color itself, and it looks a little different on the front. But the dust cover looks a lot like the original, and the end papers have the same map of Central Florida that I'll show you a little bit later. So, The Lion's Paw by Rob White, illustrated by Ralph Ray. Well, then 12 years, well, I better show you first. I got to show you this. This is where Leslie inscribed it for me and for Sheila. I don't know if you can read that or not. It says, "To Terrell and Sheila, let the Lion's Paw's magic live in your hearts forever. Thank you for sharing the magic with so many. Love," oh, no, yours. I think it says yours, Leslie. Isn't that nice? Well, she inscribed each of them similar to that. I really love that. So that's wonderful. Then 12 years passed, and along came the virus that we've already talked about. And I decided, why not read this for the kids in the county? But one problem. I know that writers work hard on their books, and they deserve to get paid for them. So they make a living off of selling their books. And so we have laws that protect the writers from people cheating and, selling their books themselves or that sort of thing. So I knew I should get a hold of Leslie and see if maybe it would be all right during this virus for me to read The Lion's Paw chapter at a time online. And I sent her an email. And she emailed me back and said, Terrell, that would be great. It would be just fine for me to do that. So this podcast series, with this introduction and then each of the 16 chapters of the book as a separate podcast, I read with the permission of Leslie Saunders, the stepdaughter and part of the folks who own the copyright to The Lion's Paw. And so thank you, Leslie, for giving me permission. I hope that if you love this book, as I think you will, you'll think about whether you'd like to have your own copy to keep and maybe read to your kids one of these days. If you would, you can order it from thelionspaw.org. Go to www.thelionspaw.org and you can order it there. Or you can check downtown with Dogwood Books or one of the other local folks and see if they'll order it for you. Or just call me up. I might be able to find a copy for you. But it's a wonderful, wonderful book, and I hope you'll support Rob White's family in republishing this book. I'm so glad that they republished it for a whole nother generation. Well, that's been a long introduction, but I wanted you to know a little bit about it, about The Lion's Paw by Rob White. Off.